Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to continue hearing evidence from Mr. Sounes. So could you ask Mr. Sounes to come in, please? Good morning, Mr. Sounes.
Good morning.
Are you ready to carry on?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. Yes, Ms.
Thank
Grange.
you. Yes, good morning. So I just want to start by picking up a few follow-up questions on some of the topics that we covered yesterday. And I want to start by just looking back at the insulation topic that we discussed. Now, you suggested yesterday that Celotex FR5000 didn't burn, it just charred. That was your understanding. And you said the whole history of polyurethanes had been solved and it was safe to use in cavities. That was my understanding at the time. So that's taken from the transcript yesterday. And I want to ask you, and really the key question is why you didn't include that kind of information in your witness statement, because you mentioned PIR at several places in your witness statement, for example, at 43.9, 116.2, and 287. In those paragraphs, you don't express a view about the properties of the material. You simply say it had been suggested by Max Fordham. Can I just ask, was that, in fact, this point about the whole history of polyurethanes had been solved by the time and it was safe to use in cavities? Is that information you've, in fact, discovered since you gave evidence in March, or can you be clear that that was, in fact, in your mind when you were looking at the insulation products on the Grenfell project?
It was definitely my knowledge, yes,
Yeah.
prior to beginning at Studio E in 2000.
And you say that, as we've discussed...
On a general level, there are very few locations in my witness statement where I have relied on an account that isn't evidenced.
Right.
So wherever possible, the statement has been built on the facts.
Yes, the documents.
Documents, yeah.
Yeah, you mean. So does that mean that your statement doesn't deal with things that you can remember about, for example, verbal conversations that were had?
Correct. And in particular, the prior knowledge of ACM, in retrospect, could have put a lot more in. But
I see.
The witness statement was an account, obviously led by our legal team, telling a story with the documents.
I see. Okay. Were you specifically told that you shouldn't include anything about your recollection of, say, verbal discussions? No, but that's how it came out in the end.
How it came out, that's... yes, that's how it came out.
Okay. Now, we see that you've said the whole history of polyurethanes had been solved and it was safe to use in cavities. Did that understanding flow from the discussion you said you had with the Celotex representative in 1998-99 about the Sun Valley fire, which you mentioned yesterday?
I can't obviously recall what fire they were referring to. That's later research on my part. But I do recall them discussing a fire where a firefighter had been killed.
Okay. And I think it's right, but can we just clarify that you said you understood that this fire had involved polyurethane insulation and cavities in the roof, which had contributed?
Well, I believe it might have been that fire. I'm not an expert in the subject of the history of fires. I believe there were probably more than one fire.
Yes, but just to be clear, was it your understanding that the fire had involved polyurethane insulation?
That I can't recall, no. It was the risk of polyurethane in cavities which had become an issue.
And which you were aware of?
Yeah, well, I wasn't aware of it in 1998-99.
But were you aware of by the time of the Grenfell project?
I'm sorry, when Celotex presented their product to us, because at that time, before the 2000, it was a relatively novel, I don't know if novel is the right word, but it was not as widely used as it is today. So we were given some background as to its use and to why it has become acceptable to use it.
I see, but I'm thinking back to what you said about the Sun Valley fire, and I want to know whether you had understood at the time of the Grenfell project that fire had involved polyurethane insulation? No. Were you aware that PIR is a type of polyurethane insulation?
I know it's blown insulation. That's not to say I believe that the substance is the same. I'm not sure.
Yes.
I just know it's a blown insulation.
Yes. And is it right that you were aware that both PIR and PUR are plastic foam insulation? You knew that much?
Well, I knew they're not mineral. They don't really present. You wouldn't use the word plastic to describe them, but I knew they weren't mineral. Yes.
Okay. And at the time, would you have had concerns about the use of a polyurethane insulation? At the time of the Grenfell project, would you have had concerns about that?
I wouldn't have looked at it at all.
Because?
Based on prior knowledge.
Because you thought that by this time they were safe to use. Is that what you're saying?
If someone had presented me with a data sheet with polyurethane, I would have obviously challenged it.
Right.
I didn't go looking for it because I was aware that it was not acceptable, or it's not generally used. It's fallen out of use, I believe.
I think my question is if you would have been concerned about the use of a polyurethane insulation, why were you not concerned about the use of a PIR insulation, given they're both plastic foam insulation products?
Have you not come sort of full circle? I was of the understanding that the susceptibility of polyurethane to burn, sustained burning, had been solved with polyisocyanurate. Right,
okay. Now, just moving on to what we discussed about the ACM material yesterday, and I asked you about the Hayes Galleria meeting that you had. Do you remember that?
Yes.
And I asked you I asked you this question: did you think about its fire performance and whether it might be sacrificing fire performance in the interest of price? And you said, no, I don't. And then you carried on. And we just want to be absolutely crystal clear.
Are you talking about insulation or the cladding?
We're talking about the cladding now.
Right.
When I asked, did you think about its fire performance and whether it might be sacrificing fire performance in the interest of price? And what I want to be clear on is, did you think about that at the time? Or is your evidence that you just can't recall whether you thought about it?
I do not recall thinking that there was any sacrifice in terms of fire performance.
Yeah.
I did not believe the panels offered any fire resistance because they're a very lightweight panel.
Okay.
Which is quite a different thing to suggesting that they offered some kind of hazard.
Okay.
It's completely different.
Thank you. And then yesterday, when we were discussing why ACM ended up being included in the NBS specification as one of the alternatives, you referred to an email from Mr. Madison of the TMO, which you said was relevant to this. And I want to see if an email that we found overnight might be the right email. So this is SEA 408836. And what we see here, it's an email from Peter Madison of the 1st of October 2013 to you, copying in David Gibson and Claire Williams at the TMO. And if we just look down to the email below, it's in response to your report back of your meeting with Harley Curtin Wall Friday the 27th of September. Do you see that there?
Yes, I did check this.
I beg your pardon?
Sorry, I did look this up last night.
And have I,
And
if we
yes,
go back up, have I got the right email?
This is the email that I recall.
Great. So what we see is Peter Madison saying, "Hi Bruce, thanks for this. Did he give a similar estimate of an aluminium solution, Peter?" So he's querying whether there was an estimate for an aluminium solution. Can you just explain to us, with reference to what you said yesterday, why this was then relevant to what went into the NBS specification?
I think it's the only there are only a handful of emails from Peter, but there is one that mentions the aluminium, and I do know that this was discussed. So this infers an expectation, but there were discussions which guided us to include it as an option.
I see. So you're saying that there were discussions in parallel at the same time with these emails on that topic, is that correct?
Yes.
And who did you have those discussions with exactly?
I think it would have come up in one of the project meetings. Around this time, as we were finalising the tender information, we did have project meetings, and I think I can recall it being discussed.
And what's your recollection as to what you were being told by the TMO about their position?
They wanted an option. That's my understanding. Sorry, I can't recall specific.
Okay, but they wanted an option for ACM, including in the specification and the employer's requirements for the project.
Aluminium. I wouldn't go so far as to say ACM.
And they were clear that that was to be included in the employer's requirements, were they, for the project?
My understanding is it was included in the form of tender. So the tendering contractors were given a box to complete for that option.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so if I can then pick up where I'd got to yesterday on the ACM, I now want to look at paragraph 377 of your statement. If we can go to SEA 3014273 at page 153. And in that paragraph, you say that on the 23rd of April 2014, Simon Lawrence at Ryden forwarded me some information received from Deborah French of Alcoa. And you say you filed the email attachments to a subfolder in Studio E's project file, and having checked the subfolder, it appears that the attachments to Ryden's email included, and then you've set out a number of documents there in subparagraphs. And if we look at paragraph 377.3, we can see that included within those documents was a British Board of Agreement certificate titled Product Sheet 1, Rainabond Architecture Wall Cladding Panels, dated the 14th of January 2008, referred to as the Bba Certificate. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then at paragraph 381 on page 154, you say this, you say, I would have read the Rainabond documents between 23rd of April 2014 and 15th May 2014, and then you go on and you say, while I do not recall specifically what I noted from them at the time, I would have been reviewing them from an architectural perspective and would have been particularly interested in the colour charts, because the focus at the time was getting planning approval for the materials in an aesthetic sense. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Now, can we take it that you don't actually have a specific recollection of sitting down and reading those Rainabond documents, and that you're making an assumption that you would have read them in that period thereafter?
I think at that point, with the exception of the Bba certificate, we had those in hard copy, particularly the colour brochures, types of colour, and those are the documents which we passed on last year. I think the Bba certificate, I did not spend long on it, but I think you'll come to a moment where there is evidence I did look at it.
Yeah. Okay. Would it have been your normal practice to read a BBA certificate for a product that you were intending to use on a project?
If you were looking to specify it, you would, yes.
Yeah.
It's usually something that is asked for by building control, very often.
Yeah.
Invariably, it's something that building control would like to see to verify that the product is suitable for its application. So having it in your hand is often only becomes necessary once you make your application for that item.
Yeah. Was it your practice to read the whole of a BBA certificate for a product you were proposing to use?
No.
What would your...
Not at this stage, where we had, this was received long before we were going to be submitting to building control.
Okay. So what would your approach to that kind of certificate be? What would you do with it at this stage?
As we have done here, we filed it under the relevant section.
Yeah. Okay. Now, we've seen that you've said there in that paragraph of your statement that you would have reviewed the product from an architectural perspective and would have been particularly interested in the colour charts, because at that point the focus was on planning approval and aesthetic appearance. But I think it's right that you also considered service life and durability of the product at this stage. Is that right?
Yes.
Now, let's look, if we go to SEA 30/10953. This is an email, if we can just blow up the top, of the 15th of May 2014 from you to Peter Blythe of Artelia. And we can see that in the first sentence, you're saying, Peter, Rainabon's BBA certificate includes the following statement regarding service life. And then you quote, the product has an ultimate service life in excess of 30 years, can be expected to retain a good appearance for up to 20 years. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So it would appear that you looked carefully at the certificate regarding its surface life and durability. Is that fair?
Yes.
Now, you go on to say at paragraph 381 of your statement, 6 lines down, you say, at this stage, neither Studio E nor Harley were carrying out detailed design. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
I just want to ask you some questions about that. Are you suggesting there that the selection of cladding products, as opposed to, for example, how to form the joints or the fixings for them, was a matter of detailed design?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are you suggesting there that the selection of cladding products, as opposed to, for example, how to form the joints or the fixings for those panels, was a matter of detailed design?
Am I saying that the selection of the product is a subject of detailed design?
Yeah. Because you're making the point here, and I want to ask you what point you're really making. You say at this stage, neither Studio E nor Harley were carrying out detailed design. And then you say, as can be seen from an email from Mark Harris to Simon Lawrence, where he says cladding, detailing, etc. will have to be dealt with as part of the main scheme design. And then you go on about conversations with Daniel Anketel-Jones. But I'm asking a more basic question, which is about this, just the simple selection of a cladding product, whether that was part of the detailed design process or came earlier.
Okay. The selection of the products came via Ryden. And you haven't given the context for this email, which I think is quite relevant.
Okay. Do you want to give me the context for it?
We had met with planning to present them the alternative cladding products,
Yeah.
the aluminium. And that had been attended by Ryden, the TMO, and Artelia. And Artelia had prepared a note for that meeting where they had, that note had been circulated, I comparing it favourably, comparing the durability of the ACM with the zinc as being comparable.
Yes.
And I didn't believe that was true.
No. Yeah.
So I was prompted to dig out the BBA
and make that clear.
contradict it. Yeah.
Mr. Sounes, I entirely accept your focus at this point was on gaining planning approval. Do you agree that before proposing materials to planners, you ought to be sure of their suitability in principle for use on the project?
Yes.
Did you look at the fire performance of the panels with reference to the Bba certificate at this stage?
I don't recall doing so, no. And I think at this stage we were not proposing the material.
I see. So you're drawing a distinction, are you, between what Ryden were doing and what you were doing?
I am. I think that needs to be stated quite clearly at this point. The proposal is coming from Ryden.
You're still retained as architect and lead consultant on the job, aren't you, at this point?
Yes.
Can you explain why you didn't look at the fire performance at this stage?
It was not a concern, and it would not be for us to complete the detailed design. It was not a concern. We've discussed yesterday that we had seen many buildings completed with the product.
And again, just back to what you mean by detailed design, do you mean that questions of fire performance of a product are matters of detailed design which you would not expect to be involved in?
We very much were involved in matters of detailed design relating to the fire issues. So I'm sorry, I'm still struggling to understand the question.
You seem to be drawing a distinction as to what was occurring at that stage and what you were involved in. And you said you weren't completing the detailed design, which seemed to imply that it wasn't your role to be looking at fire performance. And I was just testing that.
Our position is, as outlined in our opening statement, is the detailed design had been taken over by the main contractor and we understood delegated to their specialist subcontractor. And this had been our expectation from the outset.
So does that mean that you didn't think it was any part of Studio E's role from that point forward to look at the fire performance of the panels that were being considered?
No. I think it was certainly, were we aware of anything, we should have raised it. But as to actually responsibility for the selection and implementation, no, that did not sit with us.
What I want to put to you is, isn't it illogical to be seeking planning permission for a material that was potentially unsuitable if it didn't have the right fire performance? Shouldn't that have been something that you checked before it's submitted for planning?
I'm struggling to answer your question because we were submitting a product which is a generic composite product, and the focus is on the finish.
Okay.
Obviously, since we've learned that it came in different cores, but that was not. That wouldn't have made a difference to the conversation about the appearance at this stage.
Okay. Can we now look at the Bba certificate itself? This is a SEA 50516. And if we can zoom in in the bottom half of that, we see under key factors assessed that it has a section, behaviour in relation to fire. Do you see that there, third heading down?
Yes.
And it says there, behaviour in relation to fire. In relation to the building regulations for reaction to fire, the panels may be regarded as having a Class 0 surface in England and Wales and a low-risk material in Scotland. See Section 6. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you have any recollection of reading that at the time?
No.
Or at any time on the Grenfell project?
No, my involvement reduced after around this point.
Yeah. So it follows, therefore, does it, that you didn't ever look at Section 6 of the certificate?
No.
If we go to the top of page 2, it states, right at the top, in the opinion of the BBA, Rainabond architectural wall cladding panels, if used in accordance with the provisions of this certificate, will meet or contribute to meeting the relevant requirements of the following building regulations. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then in the detail information we get, two kind of main sections down, it says the panels are judged to meet the Class 0 requirements. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
Did you have an awareness, aside from this certificate, which you said you didn't look at, that the panels had a Class 0 rating under the relevant England and Wales requirements?
I can't recall. I would have assumed that they had, on the basis of it being aluminium, but I don't recall.
Okay. If we go on to page 3 of this certificate, under the heading General, at the top, in the third paragraph, there's a paragraph that says it is important for designers, planners, contractors and or installers to ensure that the installation of the cladding is in accordance with the certificate holder's instructions and the information given in this certificate. Do you see that?
Yes.
And again, were you aware that it would be important for a designer to ensure that the installation of the cladding, were you aware in general terms, in terms of looking at BBA certificates, that it was important for designers to ensure that the installation was in accordance with the certificate holder's instructions and the information given?
I didn't understand that as being the purpose of this BBA certificate, no.
Okay.
Our practice typically would be to approach a supplier in this instance and discuss with them the requirements of the project and understand how their system could be used for the specific application. I didn't see it as the purpose of the BBA to tell you that.
Okay. And I think it's right at this time you did understand that there was a difference between a riveted system and a cassette system. Is that correct?
Yes.
At page 4, if we can look at paragraph 3.6, it says there, 3.6 at the very last part of that general section, all design aspects of the installation should be checked by a suitably qualified chartered engineer or other appropriately qualified person for advice on specific construction details, flue pipe penetrations, etc. The certificate holder should be consulted. So just taking that first sentence, were you aware that all design aspects of the installation should be checked by a suitably qualified chartered engineer? Was that something that you'd been made aware of by looking at, for example, other BBA certificates for other products?
Again, the relevance of a BBA certificate, I don't think there is relevance for BBA certificates here. Where you have a specialist cladding package, whether it be a roof or elevation, would involve some engineering to verify it.
Would it be fair to say that you principally saw the purpose of the BBA certificate to be something that you could provide to building control when the time came to satisfy building control that the relevant requirements were met? Is that really how you viewed that BBA certificate?
I don't recall looking at it in those terms for this product, but for other products that I've used on other projects, yes, it has. It's often something we've had to chase to get our hands on.
Okay. Let's look then at page 5 under section 6. If we could zoom in on that whole section, yeah. So we have a detailed section here, behaviour in relation to fire. And so I think you've said you didn't read this at the time of the Grenfell project, is that right?
No.
At any time?
No, I wouldn't.
No. And it's referring in 6.1 to a standard sample of the product with a grey-green Duragloss coating being tested and achieving European Class B. Now, you've already told us that at the time you weren't aware of the European classification and testing system. So is it right that you wouldn't have understood what a Class B meant, even if you'd read it?
No.
When you say no, do you mean, yes, I wouldn't have understood
wouldn't
it?
have understood
yeah. But did you understand, I want to ask you about the use of the phrase standard sample there, because what we see in the next subparagraph 6.2 is it's drawing a distinction between a standard sample of the product and then a fire retardant sample of the product. Were you ever aware that there was this distinction in terms of these Rainabon panels between a standard and a fire retardant sample?
I do not recall being aware of.
So that's not something you were ever told by Oconic or CEP or Harley?
My recollection is the core was never discussed.
And then in 6.4, there's a warning. It says there, these performances may not be achieved by other colours of the product, and the designations of a particular colour should be confirmed by, and then it says in England and Wales, test or assessment in accordance with approved document B. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So again, I just want to ask you in general, were you aware that there might be different performances achieved by other colours, and that that's something that needed to be confirmed on a specific project?
I wasn't aware of it at the time. I would have thought it a very strange thing to say at the time.
Yeah.
I would have thought the colour would have made negligible difference.
Okay. So you weren't aware in general that if you were choosing a different colour or finish, that might affect the fire performance and therefore ought to be something that you checked?
As I say, the finish is so thin, I would have thought there would have been negligible difference. In fact, why would it be worth even mentioning? I couldn't understand. I wouldn't have understood that at the time.
Yeah. And then at the end of this section, behaviour in relation to fire, at 6.6, it says cavity barriers should be incorporated behind the cladding as required by the National Building Regulations, but should not block essential ventilation pathways. And then we see this sentence, particular attention should be paid to preventing the spread of fire from within a building, breaching the cladding system through window and door openings. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, I appreciate you didn't read this at the time, but I want to know whether you were aware of that need for particular attention with these kind of panels for preventing the spread of fire through window and door openings.
Well, I didn't read this section. Had I read it, I wouldn't have understood that paragraph.
You wouldn't have understood it?
No.
So you wouldn't have understood that it might be linking back to the provisions in approved document B about cavity barriers around openings?
No, to me this suggests you can't have windows. That's my reading of it.
Isn't it saying just that it's something that needs particular attention to preventing the spread of fire, breaching the cladding system through window and door openings, that it's something that has to be a particular focus, not saying you can't use these where you've got windows, but saying you've got to have a tight focus on that topic?
That's not what it says. It says preventing the spread of fire from a building breaching the cladding system through a window. So no windows. Sorry, I find it absurd. I wouldn't have understood that.
Okay. If you hadn't understood it, would you have clarified it? If
yes,
you read a Bba
yes.
certificate and you don't understand something, would you routinely?
If we had a relationship with the suppliers, yes, I possibly would have. But this is all hypothetical because I didn't.
In paragraph 386 of your statement, you say that you've since the fire, you've now read the BBA certificate, and you say now, with the benefit of hindsight, there was nothing on the face of it that alarmed, warned, or concerned you about Ryden's proposal to use the ACM. Is it right that even now you wouldn't have thought that the caveat in 6.4 about different colours would have been something that would be important to follow up?
If I was reviewing this with the supplier, I might ask, because it seems a curious point to make, that one colour could make any difference at all. Sorry, your question was, do I think now that it would have been important to us?
Yeah, you've said in your statement, you've said, I've read it, and even now, there'd been nothing that alarmed, warned, or concerned me about Ryden's proposal to use ACM. And what I'm asking is, when you read that paragraph 6.4, these performances may not be achieved by other colours, did that not strike you as something that you would have been concerned about and would have wanted reassurance on?
I might have done, had I been reading it, yes, I might have done, but I repeat, that does seem a strange point to make.
Okay. Now, I showed you the email that you sent of the 15th of May 2014, where you forwarded the BBA certificate on to Peter Blythe of Artelia. And there you refer to the statement on the panel's service life and appearance. And to establish that, you would have had to have gone to section 9 of this certificate on the top of page 6. So that's one page on from the fire section. Can we just look at that? So page 6 of this. Yes, so there under 9.1, do you see that? That's where it's talking about expected to have an ultimate service life in excess of 30 years. Do you see that?
Yes.
And that was the information you were then relaying on to Artelia, and you've explained to us helpfully what the context to that was. But it remains your evidence, does it, that despite looking at that specific section, you wouldn't have looked at the fire performance section on the way through reading the certificate?
I can't recall, but I could well have used the search function.
Is it right that you did not ever seek any specific guidance on the meaning and effect of the BBA certificate from Exova?
No, I didn't.
And you didn't ever ask for any discussions about the BBA certificate with Ryden or Harley?
No.
And you didn't contact the manufacturer, Alcoa or Arconic, and ask for any further information?
No.
No. And I think it's right, but can you confirm that you never yourself sought any further advice from Exova on the fire performance of the cladding panels after this point?
I didn't, no.
Studio E didn't? Do you know whether anyone else at Studio E did?
Obviously, there's all of Neil's evidence and his witness statement.
Yeah.
Which I was aware of at the time, but that's all I can...
Are you saying you were aware at the time that Neil Crawford specifically asked Exova and Mr. Ashton about the fire performance of the ACM panels? Is that your clear recollection at the time?
No, I don't have a clear recollection of that.
No. Now, just a few brief questions about the planning process and ACM, because we know we're kind of within the planning process in what we've been looking at for some of this morning. You've set out your evidence of the planning process in your witness statement. I'm not going to go through that in detail, but I think there are some matters that we can agree on, and I just want to check that. Is it right that the planning permission that was granted, including a condition that materials to be used on the external faces of the building were to be subject to separate approval by RBKC? Is that correct?
Yes.
And so, in effect, the planning permission itself did not give approval to any particular kind of cladding panel. Is that right?
Yes.
is it correct that the RBKC planning department was generally wary of the change from zinc to ACM?
I think you're asking me to summarise their response, which is obviously best for them to give, but that's not an unfair portrayal. They not wary, but they had concerns about the overall appearance, which is documented.
Yeah, that's my next question. Is it fair to say that the planning officer's primary concern was the colour and appearance of the panels?
Yes, it was.
And there was also an issue, wasn't there, over whether a face-fixed or a cassette panel would be more acceptable to the planners?
Yes.
And is it right that ultimately the decision to go for cassette fix over face fix was driven by the planning officers?
Driven. The planners, I think, are on record saying they didn't like the visible fixings.
Yeah, the visible fixings in the faced fix.
Yes. But whether that's fair to say they drove it, I'm not sure.
Just let's look at an email on that. This is at SEA 3011373. This is an email of the 28th of July from the planners to David Gibson of the TMO. So this is Mark Watterson. He's in the RBKC planning department, isn't he?
Mark, no, he's the planning consultant.
Sorry, he's the planning
He
consultant.
did sit in the RBKC planning. He commuted from Manchester, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So he's emailing David Gibson and copying in you, Grenfell feedback. And then you see in the second paragraph, I think what you were just describing, the email exchange is set out below, but in particular, the LPA, what does LPA stand for?
Local Planning Authority?
Yeah. Object to the idea of any exposed fixings on the building. I pushed them on having exposed fixings higher up the building, but their concern, which has also been borne out of other site visits, is that the rivets will become rust attractors and then stain the cladding. They're aware of the cost savings, but on this occasion they do not outweigh their concerns over quality, appearance and longevity. I advise Claire that I do agree with this position and I do not feel it's worth pushing any further. However, please let me know if you feel any differently. And then he says we're still looking at the colour options. So is that a good example of the mood music you were getting back from the planners about their reluctance to use the face fixed and their preference for the cassettes?
Yeah, I think there are more. There's an email from Sarah Scannell, I think, after following her site visit, where she directly communicates their views.
Yeah. And we can see that this was notwithstanding the awareness, and we see that from this email, that the cassette fix was more expensive than the face fix.
I'm sorry,
So they're clearly aware. It said in the third line of that paragraph, they are aware of the cost savings.
Yes.
So they're aware that the face fixed was a lot cheaper than the cassettes, wasn't it?
I don't know how much they knew.
Okay. Well, they're clearly aware of that in principle, based on this email. And can I just ask you one final question on the planning? Did you ever discuss fire safety of the cladding system with RBKC's planning department?
No, I don't recall.
And would that be because that was a matter that was actually for RBKC building control rather than for their planners?
Yes.
Yeah. Now, at this point, I want to ask you some questions about resident consultation. And I'm doing this now because what I'm going to be asking you is if you can help us a little bit more about what information was provided to the residents about the cladding panels during that consultation process. And what I want to look at is something called the Grenfell Tower Regeneration Project Engagement Statement. If we can bring this up, this is at RBK 50236. And so we can see there got your label on the top left, Studio E, but then other logos around the bottom, and it's Grenfell Tower Regeneration Project Engagement Statement, Planning Application, October 2012. And is it right that this was submitted as part of the planning application?
Yes.
At that point? Who actually put this document together? Do you know? Is it a document you're familiar with?
I haven't looked at it recently.
But was it something Studio E put together, or was it put together by another party?
It's very unlikely we put it together.
Okay.
I think it would have been between Taylor Young and RBKC.
Yeah. We'll see. What it does is it sets out in the introduction what the purpose was of the consultation, what the strategy was for consultation. And then as we go through, it contains within it a number of pieces of information, for example, responses to questionnaires or newsletters that were sent to residents, and feedback through it about what was being said by the community in response to the proposals. Now, if we can turn to section 1, the introduction on page 3. We can see, picking it up in the second sentence of that first paragraph, it says the consultation strategy agreed by Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea in partnership with Kensington and Chelsea TMO was based on building positive engagement with local communities and stakeholders through consultation prior to planning submission. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And was that your understanding of in very general terms, what the consultation strategy was that had been agreed?
I wasn't aware that they were following any guidance. I was aware there was a consultation strategy in place, and we participated in it, yes.
Yeah. And then paragraph 2, it says the focus was to continue to provide opportunities for local residents to understand and influence the development of the design proposals for the Grenfell Tower Regeneration Project before the application was submitted. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And again, was that your understanding, that it was to provide opportunities for residents to influence the development of the design proposals?
Yes.
And then at paragraph 3, it says, in analysing the responses, there is clear evidence of support for the project. However, during the early stages of the consultation, there were some concerns over elements of designs. Whilst we recognise that not everyone will support the proposals, many of these concerns have now been addressed and are reflected in the proposed development. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, can you recall, did any of the concerns relate to the external wall and the design proposals for that?
No, it was something that was consulted on, but I don't recall any specific concerns.
Okay. Can you recall in general what the types of concerns were? I mean, we don't need to go into it in detail, but can you recall the kind of broad topics that were raised?
Before coming, I looked at which I think you will have, the feedback summary from the sort of formal consultation that was done, I think, in May 2012.
Yes.
And the initial concerns were around security. So I do remember that being raised, and the request for cameras.
Yeah.
Obviously not directly related to the proposed works.
Okay.
But I do remember that.
Yeah. And then finally, we can see it says there in the last paragraph, it also meets the guidance set out in the Localism Act 2011, which sets out a requirement for community engagement in advance of the submission of major planning applications. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then if we can go to page 4, this is the consultation strategy. And what this does is set out the approach to facilitating that's detailed below, and we see that in a number of sub-paragraphs you can see the types of strategies and measures that were being said to have been deployed in order to get the feedback. So we've got community briefing session in February 2012, then questionnaires with feedback questions, as from May, weekly evening consultation meetings or weekly drop-in sessions. We don't need to go through them all. Do you see that? So they're set out there. And is it right that you were involved in some of those specific sessions?
Yes.
In which feedback was given by residents?
The questionnaire, I can remember one questionnaire session, which is, I think, was the May one. The evening consultation events, myself and possibly one or more from Studio E attended. I know that the KCTMO were on site often during the day as well. Right. I think.
Yeah.
In the base of the tower in an office with drawings on the wall.
Okay. Yeah.
And that went on through the summer. There were a number of them.
Just in general, had you had any experience of dealing with issues arising from consultation with residents in a social housing context before doing a building project? Was that something you had experience of?
No.
When you embarked on this process, and in terms of your involvement, what did you think that the consultation would involve? Were you aware that it would involve these kind of measures?
We were led by RBKC as to what we were going to do, but I understood it would be a mixture of presentations to a group, and it's an information evening and questionnaires and discussions one-to-one with people in a room.
Yeah. And who did you discuss the need for consultation with at RBKC?
As I recall, it was Mark Anderson who led on that.
Right.
When I say led, I believe he was quite focused on it.
Yeah.
But he delegated that to us and others.
Yeah.
And he attended them as well.
Yeah. Now, if we can go to section 3 of this document on page 5. This talks about the planning brief consultation, and I just want to quickly look at the 4th paragraph. It says there, resident consultation meetings gave assistance to Studio E when developing designs which meet the needs of TMO requirements and to residents' expectations. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And would you agree with that statement, that the resident consultation meetings did give assistance to Studio E when developing designs?
I would agree to that. You're going to ask me how, I think. But yes, I would agree to that. It was a two-way process, but it was also explaining the proposals to the residents.
Yeah.
So they can be asked questions and understand the proposals.
Yeah. Then at the bottom of that page, under a heading Section 4 Newsletters, we can see it says, if we can go right to the bottom of that page. Sorry, actually, it's the first paragraph under newsletters. I apologise. It says there, the main purpose of the project newsletters was to provide key information of the project and feedback from residents following consultation meetings. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then I'm going to show you some examples in a moment where we see the newsletters actually setting out information about some of the cladding proposals.
Yes.
I just want to ask you some questions about that. Did you actually play a part yourself in devising and formulating the questionnaires that contained feedback questions for residents? Was that a process you were involved with?
I don't recall doing that, no.
No. Who do you think devised those questionnaires? Do you know?
Again, between KCTMO and Taylor Young, I'm not sure.
Yeah, okay. Now, if we go to section 6 of this engagement statement on page 7, this sets out the results of a questionnaire sent to residents in March 2012. So you can see at the top there, it says residents' views feedback was sought via KCTMO roadshow and the issue of a questionnaire to Grenfell Tower residents with a deadline return date of the 9th of March 2012. And then it tells us, as at the 22nd of March 2012, how many have been completed. And then it actually sets out the results below. Do you see that?
Yeah.
And question 2 is as follows. It says, do you think Grenfell Tower would benefit from thermal insulation cladding? This would have the effect of making the building warmer in winter and cooler in summer, and would mean homes require less heating. It would also improve the external appearance of the building. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware that that question was part of that March 2012 questionnaire?
I wasn't.
No? Okay. Can you help us as to whether any information had been given to residents prior to answering that question about the thermal insulation cladding that might be being proposed?
No, I think this questionnaire predated our involvement.
Yeah. So it wouldn't have been possible to give any details at that point of the specific insulation that was being proposed by Studio E?
No.
No. Do you recall any discussions with residents at any later stage about the specific type of insulation to be used in the external wall?
I can't recall discussing it, no.
No. Okay. Do you have any recollection of any discussions at any time about fire safety more generally of the materials to be used in the external overcladding?
No.
No. Then if we can go on to page 14, this is a table setting out consultation summary. You can see the heading section 7 consultation summary above. And it's outlining a number of initiatives that have occurred and what the feedback's been. And if we can go on to page 15, we can see a line for the 26th of July 2012. Do you see it says there, evening consultation meeting, daytime drop-in sessions and newsletter. And then the topic was discussion with design proposals. And the feedback says this, external canopy. Residents would like to see a new canopy which offers protection and shelter around the block. And then it says, external cladding proposal favourable to residents seems to be for profile zinc. Although we seem to have some feedback on type of cladding, it is still undecided on their preferred colour for the cladding. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Can you help us by this stage as to what information about the zinc external cladding had been provided to residents in the context of these discussions?
Offhand, I can't. You have to go back on. I'd have to go back on, based on the date, as to what the board was that we presented that evening.
Yeah. So just to be clear, it talks about an evening consultation meeting. Were you present there at that evening consultation meeting?
I'd need to check, but I probably was.
Yeah. And you talked about you just said what board we were presenting. Can you just explain to us what you would do at that evening meeting, or what you recall doing?
Well, there were a number of these meetings which had slightly different formats. So often there was an address from Mark to an audience of residents, and then that would have been followed by a walk around. So it was a kind of exhibition. We had our A1 boards on easels, so we could stand and talk to people. And both TMO and Studio E staff were present and could talk people through what was presented on the boards.
Yeah. Can you recall whether the residents were ever given any information about the nature and composition of the zinc external cladding?
As I say, I would have to check what was shown on that board, but you did pick up a newsletter in yesterday's session.
Yes, I'm going to come to that in a moment. We'll look at that, where we see some details of the VM zinc, I think, being provided.
Yes.
Yeah. In your mind, what was the purpose of discussing, for example, the zinc cladding proposals at that kind of resident meeting? What were you seeking to get from it in terms of the design process?
the subject of colour and appearance in general was always a sensitive one, and we were seeking to get people on board with what we're trying to get a consensus, certainly with the residents, but also within ourselves as to what we were going to present. So we were putting proposals forward and seeing what came back as to whether there was any strong push one way or the other.
Yeah. So I think to summarise, are you saying that what you're seeking to get out of it was primarily about the colour and the appearance of the cladding to help you with your design in that aspect?
Well, it was the whole thing. We presented three-dimensional views of the building, but obviously the cladding was a key part of it, but so were the windows.
Yeah. Now, after this, what the document we're looking at, this engagement statement, has a number of appendices which contain relevant information about this engagement that's summarised earlier in the document. Can we just look at Appendix C on page 23? These are minutes and notes from the pre-planning meeting of the 19th of July. And if we go to page 24, which is page 1 of the minutes, if we can just expand the bottom of that page. So this is... Sorry, maybe we should look at the top first just to clarify what this is. So it's minutes of a meeting, Grenfell Tower Regeneration Project. It's at the RBKC Town Hall on the 19th of July 2012, and it's LPA pre-application meeting. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And you're present. We can see that from the list.
Yes.
And then if we can go down, there's a heading canopy and overcladding that I just want to look at. So we can see in the middle of that page, it says BS, so that must be you, Bruce Sounes,
yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Explain that an overclad and rain screen system is being proposed. Zinc or Eternic particle board are being investigated. And then it says OK with EG, but suggested that colour choice should avoid grey. Can you help us as to what that means? OK with EG?
Edward George.
Edward George, the planner.
I think he was the principal planner we engaged with throughout.
And then it says this in the next paragraph, considering aluminium windows, but still talking to residents about design, considering safety, etc., considering ribbon approach to window design, but depends on infill panels. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Do you know whether any details of the window infill panels were ever provided to the residents as part of this process?
No, this was long before we were at stage E. This was stage C. Consultation, so we wouldn't have put technical detail forward anyway.
And just to be clear, I think it does follow from your answers earlier, but I want you to clarify, did any discussions occur about fire safety or fire performance of the external wall materials at this meeting?
I do not recall that being discussed, no.
Then if we can go on to page 33 at Appendix G, and this is newsletters. So this is the appendix with the newsletters, and if we look at page 34, we see the newsletter of the 15th of July 2012. And in the main part of that page, we can see a heading feedback from residents. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And just looking for a moment at the strip on the black strip on the left. 2 paragraphs up from the bottom, it says this: KCTMO is seeking to work with residents and the community to develop the proposals for Grenfell Tower and has appointed Studio E design team and contractor Ledbetter to deliver this project. And then it says KCTMO and RBKC wish to ensure that the regeneration of the tower delivers maximum benefit to the residents and community. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then in the middle column at the bottom, under the heading What You Have Said, you can see a heading that says you wish to be involved in the development of the proposals for Grenfell Tower. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And was that something you were very aware of at the time of this engagement, that the community did want to be involved in the development of the proposals?
I have looked at those results of the May questionnaire, and I think that was one of the questions.
Yeah.
Which supported that, yes.
And then on the right, we can see 4 paragraphs down from the top, there's a sentence that said, there is no clear opinion about the colour or type of external cladding. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And what did you understand type to mean? We've discussed colour already and that you were looking for feedback on that. What would you understand type to be meaning there?
Alternative material.
Yeah.
I think that there was no. They weren't giving a preference to any particular type of cladding.
Right. And you'd given different options, had you, as part of your presentations? You'd looked at different options?
I would have to refer back to the boards, but I think we did.
Okay. Then look at page 36. This is a newsletter of the 22nd of July 2012. Under feedback from residents on the right-hand side, there's a heading external cladding. And it says there, but so by this time it looks like it says a wide variety of options have been presented and there is a strong preference for metal cladding. And it says aluminium, 1, aluminium sheet, 2, composite metal sheet, 3, profiled zinc sheet. Further work is to be done on this and in particular possible colours. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then over on to page 37 of this same newsletter, right at the bottom of that page, it says, we look forward to your feedback on, and then it's got external cladding as the second bullet. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So clearly it would appear that the consultation's carrying on and a variety of options have been presented and that there's a strong preference emerging for metal cladding. Was that your understanding?
I think the boards were the primary form of presentation. I may have taken samples to these events. I can't recall. And I believe that people would be pointing at images of buildings with cladding on it,
Yeah.
indicating a preference. So I'm not sure you would draw a conclusion that it was a strong preference
Okay,
one way or the other.
right. Can you remember, you may not, but can you remember when the idea of aluminium sheet was first introduced in the context of those discussions?
No, as I say, I suspect it relates to an image with a caption
Right.
saying aluminium sheet, but I would want to check.
Yeah. Then if we can go on to page 38 and look at the newsletter of the 1st of August. In the right-hand column, 6 paragraphs down, there's a question where it says, are leaseholders' concerns being taken into consideration? And it says, we have engaged with a number of leaseholders on an individual basis, and we have additionally offered to meet with the leaseholders collectively to explain the proposals that have been developed so far. Do you see that?
Yes.
Do you know why it was that some leaseholders were engaged with on an individual basis?
Well, obviously, long leaseholders have ownership of their flat,
Yeah.
and they can change it as they wish. And they may have had specific concerns that they wanted to raise directly with the TMO, who are effectively their landlord. But I don't recall exactly what those issues were.
From your point of view, were you aware that there had been engagement with a wider group, including tenants with shared common interests in the building? Had that happened as well?
I think all the residents' engagement was open. It wasn't exclusive or broken down.
So are you saying anyone could have come along to
Yes.
like the evening meetings or the drop-in
Yes,
sessions?
yes, I
Yeah.
believe it was advertised.
Yeah. And then if we look at page 40 of this document, we can see some information which appears to have been attached to this 1st of August 2012 newsletter. If we look at the very bottom half of that page, we can see that there is a section, zinc cladding systems and its advantages. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And then we've got some boxes and diagrams on the right. Some of these are familiar to us because I actually took you to some of this yesterday when we were looking
Yes.
at the VM zinc composite. And we see this is the one where it had reference to a high density mineral rich core, combining the qualities of zinc, etc., with rigidity and flatness. And then in the little diagram on the right, at point 2, it's got polyethylene core FR fire retardancy. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, in the light of that, can you recall on what basis this particular product and this particular detailed information on that product was being shared with residents?
I can't remember the exact circumstances, but I think it's related to the image above, which is of a building clad in the same product, which we may have used, and that's in the presentation.
Right, so you can't help us as to why this particular product was being singled out to be included within this newsletter at this point?
I can't remember exactly.
And can you remember whether it provoked any discussions? We see the reference there to polyethylene core FR fire retardancy. Did that information that went out in that newsletter ever provoke any discussions about the FR fire retardancy of the core of the panel?
No, not to my knowledge.
And then finally, on this document, before I ask you some follow-up questions, which we might do after the break on consultation, I just want to finish going through this document. If we look at page 42, and this is the newsletter of the 9th of August 2012, feedback from residents. In the right-hand column, it says, with reference to the 26th of July 2012, actually, I think we've looked at this before, actually. External cladding proposed favourable to residents. I think we've considered that already because we've looked at it earlier. Sorry. Mr. Chairman, I think that probably would be a good moment for a break. I'm going to carry on with the resident consultation theme and just ask Mr. Sounes about some emails after this.
Yeah, well, if that's a good point from your point of
Yeah,
view, I think it's probably sensible to stop there. Mr. Sounes, we're going to have a break at this point. I'm going to ask you to go with the usher in just a moment, and to remember, please, not to talk to anyone about your evidence while you're out of the room. All right? And we'll come back at 11:45, please.
Okay.
All right? Thank you very much. Quarter to 12,
Thank
please. Thank you. Right, would you ask Mr. Sounes to come back, please? Thank you. Right. And Ms. Grange, before we continue, I understand that a number of people have been suffering problems with the receipt of the live transcript. Mine wasn't working, but it may be working now, but I understand for some people receiving it elsewhere, there have been difficulties. I'm sorry about that. The technical people are doing their best to resolve the problems, and I hope that they'll succeed in doing that before very long. Right, are you ready to carry on, Mr. Sounes?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so continuing with the theme of resident consultation, what I now want to do is just take you to a number of emails that are relevant to that topic and ask you some related questions. Can we look at a document RBK 50474? So these are minutes of a meeting that you attended at RBKC on the 30th of August 2012, Housing Digest meeting. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, can you confirm that at this meeting with Councillor Coleridge, you told him and others that 80% of the residents were happy with the proposals as recorded in the minutes? Can we just have a look in the minutes? This is a question that's come in quite recently, so we can just look down to the next page. Sorry, page 3, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there we go. So under heading 5, it says Bruce Sounes of Studio E attended and gave a presentation. Do you see that there?
Yeah.
And then at the bottom, after the bullets, it says 80% of the residents were happy with the proposals. Do you see that there? Immediately after the bullet points. So can you confirm, first of all, that that's what you said at the meeting?
I can't recall saying that. I might recall attending the meeting, a meeting. I mean, this was not a normal meeting for me to attend.
Yeah. Can you recall the substance of the point? Can you recall being aware that, as far as you were concerned, 80% of the residents were happy with the proposals?
This is quite detailed. The discussions about the proposals, I'm struggling to remember that.
Okay.
So I would also struggle to remember the 80% of residents item.
So can you help us as to where that 80% figure might have come from and how that was arrived at?
No.
No, okay. Can we now look at an email that we looked at yesterday, which came up in the chronology of the ACM story? This is at SEA 403965. And if we can look at the bottom of page 1, this was the email that you sent to Mr. Blades on Tuesday, the 10th of April, in anticipation of what appeared to be a meeting at site.
Yes.
And do you remember there's that sentence, that paragraph there about it's important to be discreet while we're there. This is at the end of the page. As the political context for the development and the development of the adjoining site is very sensitive. And then you say this, I would refrain from discussing with residents or staff who you might meet or discussing drawings where anyone can see them. There is enough misinformation about on the estate and we don't want to add to it unwittingly. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, in the light of all the resident engagement work that we've just been discussing and the stated intention of that engagement work, the question is, can you explain here how your comments are compatible with the aim to be having positive engagement with the community and stakeholders at this time?
I don't see them as incompatible at all. We are employed by RBKC to assist in the design of the refurbishment. And this is, I think, a week or two into, or a month into the project. And I have been warned off speaking even to TMO staff about the proposals. I hope you can pull up Mark's email.
I've got that. I can take you to that in a moment.
Which, as far as I recall, is the source of my comments here.
I see. Yes, you referred to this yesterday, and I think we found it overnight. Can we go to SEA 403591? And if we look at page 2 at the bottom of the page, this is an email from Mark Anderson to you a month earlier of the 5th of March 2012, where he says, "Good morning, Bruce." And then in the second line of the email, "You are not under any circumstances to make contact with Robert Regan or the other estate inspectors. Requests for information are to be directed to myself, copied to Alistair and Siobhan. Please let me know what floor plans you require." Is that the email you were referring to?
Yes, and I think I would have spoken to Mark after that correspondence.
And what did you discuss with him after this?
No, I can't remember. What I mean is we would have discussed this item, the sensitivity around what the TMO wanted to be known. In other words, how they went about engaging with the community. It wasn't something they wanted to leave to a chance encounter on site.
I see. And what messages did you get from those discussions? What did you come away thinking in the light of those discussions?
Just to be careful. I didn't entirely understand the role of the state inspectors on site. I didn't understand the sensitivity they specifically had.
Did you ever think to yourself during the project, well, that's not very consistent with what I'm also being told about community engagement and engagement with stakeholders?
No, I don't think that's fair. I think there was ample opportunity to engage all parties, and what I was obviously wary about is somebody who I didn't know, who might say something which could be misinterpreted on site, and there was a strong possibility he would be noticed on site.
Yeah. If we just look at the top of this email string, at the top of page 1, there's another email from Mr. Anderson on the 5th of March 2012 to you. And he gives a bit more explanation. He says, "Robert is a TMO employee, and I wish to ensure that we manage the dissemination and sources of information." Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you feel at the time that the TMO was taking a close interest in managing the dissemination of information about the project?
That's certainly reflected in that. I wasn't entirely clear of the reasons.
And did that actually affect you in terms of what Studio E were able to do in terms of community engagement? Did that have a knock-on effect in terms of what you were then doing?
I don't believe it had any impact on our formal or informal engagements, no.
Okay. Can I just look? I've just got a number of emails to show you. Can we look at another email? This is forward in time to the 5th of July 2012. If I can go to IBI 6048. So this is an email from Mark Watterson, the planning consultant, is that right?
Yes.
To you, Studio E Architects. And he says it's further to your earlier conversation about the progression of the refurbishment. And then I want to pick up on what he says in paragraph 2. He says, "I will seek a meeting with the planning officer aiming for Thursday the 19th July. We will have been informed by the first rounds of consultation at this stage, so we will have a clearer idea of the residents' views. I would suggest that a series of these meetings will be needed to agree the design prior to the submission of the application." And then he says this in paragraph 3, "I would recommend that it would be beneficial investing time now to ensure that residents are on side as much as possible prior to the submission of the application. This will help reduce the risk of judicial review and is, of course, best practice. I would suggest that at this stage, this consideration should be as much of a driver on the application submission programme as the projected start on-site date. Do you see all of that?
Yes.
Did you understand in that third paragraph what he meant by reducing the risk of judicial review? Did you understand what that meant?
Yes.
Why do you think the risk of judicial review was a factor on this project? Is that something you thought was a legitimate concern?
It's a factor on all projects, to be honest, that meets any kind of local opposition. It is a factor.
Yeah. What did you understand him to mean by, he talks about it being beneficial in that first line of paragraph 3, beneficial investing time now to ensure that residents are on side as much as possible. What did you understand the on side to mean?
To win support from the residents for the proposals.
Did you ever feel during the process that the aim of the consultation was merely to persuade residents round to the TMO's ideas of what it wished to achieve, rather than to provide an opportunity to respond genuinely to what the residents wanted? Did you ever feel that during the process?
I think that's putting it a bit simplistically. The focus of the investment was on the infrastructure, and the TMO were taking seriously the input of their residents. That's how I took it.
Okay.
There was, I felt at the time, considerable effort put into gathering input on the various items.
Yeah. Now, if we can go forward in time again, on the 20th of August 2012, if we can look at an email, TMO 120037758 on page 2. There's an email at the bottom there from Peter Martindale. Can you explain what his role was on the project? It's an email to you.
I don't recall his role. In fact, I knew him as Peter Martin. Sorry, Martindale's unusual to see it like that. He was a studio employee, yes. I can't remember what his role was.
So he was a Studio E employee, that was your recollection?
No, I'm not sure. The email's been redacted.
Yes. Let's look over the page, see if there's anything at the bottom of the email. No, that doesn't help. If we look at, I want to look at paragraph 4, subparagraph 4. I'm looking for a paragraph, I'm not sure that's the reference. No, I can't see that there. Let's come back to this email another time if we need to. Can I ask you then, finally on this topic, can we look at an email chain, SEA 406493. This is an email, if we zoom in at the top of the page. Now, this is an email from Neil Crawford to Ben Rogerson of Exover on the 5th of November 2012, so forward in time again. And you're CC'd into it, Bruce Sounes. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And this was explored in Mr. Crawford's evidence, but I want to just explore it briefly with you since you were copied in. He states, can you help with the query below from Colin Charles at Ledbetter? I understand Colin has been challenged by one of the residents that the current redesign of the landscape surrounding Grenfell Tower compromises the fire access to Grenfell Tower. And then it says the individual concerned is a known troublemaker. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, did you have any concerns when you were copied into this email about the reference there to a known troublemaker. Did that come to your attention? Do you remember noticing that?
I appreciate I was copied on, and it did overlap with Grenfell, but I don't recall
Do you ever remember
reacting to the email.
Sorry.
I don't recall the email at the time.
Okay. Do you ever remember discussing this topic with Mr. Crawford, the fact that there'd been concerns expressed by one of the residents about the landscape surrounding and the fire access being compromised, or the individual being a known troublemaker? Do you ever recall any discussions with Mr. Crawford about that?
I think the issue of the access around the tower came up time and again. That's reflected in correspondence. But I can't recall that in the context of any troublemakers here, no.
Right, yeah. Do you agree, looking at this email now, that the topic that appears to have been raised was a wholly legitimate one to be concerned about, given the importance of firefighting access to a building like Grenfell Tower?
I think it was raised from the outset, yes, I agree.
And it's a legitimate topic to be concerned about, isn't it?
Yes.
Do you think that emailing in these terms, and really it's a reference to the individual concerned is a known troublemaker, do you think that's compatible with a positive attitude towards resident engagement and consultation?
It's copied to consultants. Neil wasn't involved in the consultation. I don't think it's relevant.
Well, I'm wondering if that's a matter for Mr. Sounes anyway. I mean, he
agree.
didn't write this.
I agree. I'm not going to pursue it any further. Thank you. So, Mr. Sounes, I now want to turn to the topic of cavity barriers and ask you some questions about the design of the cavity barriers in the facade. Now, turning first to the requirement of the building regulations, were you aware at the time of this project of the B34 requirement? The building should be designed and constructed so that the unseen spread of fire and smoke within concealed spaces in its structure and fabric is inhibited. Was that something you were aware of?
The principle I was aware of, yes.
Yeah. And can we have a look at section 9 of approved document B? So if we go, this is CLG 50173. This is the 2006 edition of ADB with 2010 amendments. So this is what would have been available in 2012. And I want to look at section 9 on page 82. And 9.1, it states that concealed spaces or cavities in the construction of a building provide a ready route for smoke and flame spread. This is particularly so in the case of voids in, above and below the construction of a building, e.g. walls, floors, ceilings and roofs. As any spread is concealed, it presents a greater danger than would be more obvious weakness in the fabric of the building. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Were you aware of that guidance in approved document B on concealed spaces and cavities when you were designing the Grenfell project?
Yes, I was.
Did you appreciate that the construction of the new facade would create a number of additional cavities?
Yes.
And did you appreciate that there was a risk of fire spread within those cavities?
Yes.
Now, approved document B also gives some guidance on the location of cavity barriers. If we can look at 9.2 on that same page, guidance there is to provide cavity barriers, and I'm just paraphrasing here, to subdivide the cavity where there would otherwise be a pathway around the fire separating element, i.e. at compartment walls and floors. This is illustrated in diagram 33, which appears on this page below. If we can have that diagram up on the page. Do you recall ever looking at this diagram during the time you worked on the Grenfell project?
I think you asked me on my second day whether I'd read Part B. in the context of this project, and I said no, but I didn't go on to explain why.
Okay.
Part B is guidance,
Yes.
and in the experience I've gained in 20 years, I've generally found it very difficult to form any definitive interpretation from the guidance.
I see.
So I may have looked at this during the course of the project, but I wouldn't have looked at it as the person considering the design. I might have looked at with either Adrian or Thomas as they were reviewing these details.
I see. So even though this was a kind of project that you've never done before, a high-rise over-cladding project, it didn't occur to you that it might be a good idea to go back and look at key provisions of ADB, including this one?
Well, I believe Thomas did. He, if not directly, certainly in connection with his conversations with suppliers as to whether the products were, how they should be used.
But I'm asking about you yourself.
Me personally, I wasn't working in that way on the project. I wasn't sitting down preparing drawings and specifications.
Okay. Now, we can see from diagram 33, it's in little grey shading with the label at the bottom, cavity barrier, that it's suggesting cavity barriers at the top of the cavity. Do you see that there, closed top of cavity?
Yes.
And it's suggesting them within the cavity at compartment floor line. Do you see that there? There's a little grey shading.
Yes.
And it's also showing cavity barriers around the windows. Can you see that?
Yes.
And it's got a specific diagram, close around openings. Do you see that there?
Yes. Yes.
And then it's also got some guidance about fire stopping in the green. Can we move on to look at the next page of ADB, at page 83? At paragraph 9.3, the guidance states that cavity barriers should be provided to close the edges of cavities, including around openings. So would you agree with me that this guidance is very clear about the need for cavity barriers around openings?
Not in the context of a rain screen facade, no. I wouldn't agree.
Okay, what was it about these provisions of ADB that we've just looked at that would suggest to you that in a rain screen cladding system you wouldn't have to provide cavity barriers around openings?
Well, the approved document's silent on rain screen. It doesn't discuss it. But I believe the diagram 33 refers to a very conventional form of construction, and not a rain screen which is essentially outside. The cavity is outside. It's vented, pressure equalized, if you like. It doesn't offer any resistance to flame from the outside or from flames coming around the window opening.
I see.
So I would have read that as unclear.
Okay. Does that mean that it was your understanding that you thought that you didn't need to provide cavity barriers around openings in this kind of rain screen cladding system?
I would have done what I believe Thomas did, and that he would have consulted.
Consulted who?
I'm not sure who he consulted, but I know that he was speaking both to Exovus, Siderise, and Harley. I'm obviously not clear on who he spoke to, and maybe we'll not know, but I know he did spend time trying to arrive at a solution.
Can I just focus on your own knowledge at this point?
My own knowledge was him summarising it to me.
No, was your understanding, your own understanding, that you didn't have to provide cavity barriers around window openings?
I had never seen one around an opening, cavity barrier around a rain screen facade. No, I regarded it as outside. Those drawings that we forwarded last year included a clutch from CGL, I think Rheinzink and KME, and there are no cavity barriers around openings.
I see. Did you ever consult any guidance to inform you about your own knowledge on this topic, or ask anybody else, any other outside parties about
I believe
whether...
Thomas was dealing with it and he consulted.
So does it amount to this, that you basically left it to Thomas to work out what the cavity barrier arrangement was?
He came back to me with his conclusion and I agreed it.
And when he came back to you with his conclusion, did he say to you, I'm only going to put the cavity barriers at compartment floor, I'm not going to put them around the windows, I think this is acceptable because... Did you have that discussion with him?
I repeat, I haven't seen a cavity barrier on a detail around a window. I don't recall it being discussed.
So I think you've just answered, you don't recall that being discussed, is that correct?
Correct, yes.
So when you said Thomas came back to me with it and I agreed, what did he come back to you about and what did you agree?
The location of the cavity barriers on the typical bay drawing.
I see. So you looked at his drawings on that and you didn't have a problem with where he put cavity barriers?
I thought they were consistent with my understanding of Part B in terms of protecting concealed spread of fire.
Yeah. Mr. Crawford said in his evidence, this was day 9, page 163, lines 4 to 8, that's just for the transcript. He was asked, did Mr. Sounes tell you that in the cavity barrier scheme there was not to be a cavity around the windows? And he said, my understanding from the discussion with him was that there wasn't a requirement for a cavity barrier around the windows. Do you recall having those discussions with Mr. Crawford?
No, I don't.
So you don't recall saying to him that there wasn't a requirement for cavity barriers around the windows?
I don't recall that specific topic, no.
Do you recall having any discussions with Mr. Crawford about the cavity barrier arrangement?
Yes, I know that came up in the conversation, the email exchanges with Exova, September 14 and March 15. I was aware of them at the time, but not. They were referring to the cavity barriers at the compartment lines.
Yeah. The Stage D report prepared by Studio E, which is dated August 2013, doesn't address cavity barriers anywhere in it. That's right, isn't it?
Yes.
In your experience, is it common for details such as cavity barriers to be addressed in the design at a later stage?
Yes, it's fair.
Do you remember at the Stage D stage ever addressing your mind at the time as to whether or not to carry out some initial design work on cavity barriers?
Stage D?
Yeah.
No.
And had you actually done, you or to your awareness anyone else at Studio E, actually done any initial work on cavity barriers at that stage?
I believe we had. But this is based on documents in our system.
Your belief at the time was based on what?
No, at the time I wasn't necessarily aware of it, but I believe looking back at the documents on our system that we were looking at the cavity barrier issue.
And who was doing that?
D. That would have been Adrian Jess.
But that was not something you were involved in?
Stage D obviously encompassed a period of hiatus, a stand down, from roughly December 12 to, I think, June 13, during which time I believe Adrian did do some work on that.
Okay. Let's move forward to the tender stage and the preparation of the tender documentation between August 2013 and January 2014. Can we look at what you say in your witness statement about this? This is SEA 30144273 at page 112. And this is paragraph 267. It starts right at the bottom of that page. And you say there, I have no recollection of how the judgment as to the placement of cavity barriers on the typical bay drawing was arrived at. And then you say, I note that cavity barriers are not shown on the draft typical bay drawing dated the 24th of September 2013, which states provision of cavity fire barrier 2BC. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So I want to focus on that very first sentence that you say you've got no recollection about how the decision about where to install cavity barriers was arrived at. Now, is it right that at that tender stage you were still taking the lead on the design within Studio E?
I was still leading on the project, yes. Yes.
Does it remain your evidence that you are unaware as to how the cavity barrier arrangement was arrived at tender stage?
I am unaware. I was unaware of the conversations that led it to those positions indicated.
I see. Can we just look at a drawing? This is SEA 402499, and we'll need the offline version. Thank you.
I should clarify. I cannot recall where the discussion came from. Thomas may have mentioned it, but I cannot recall.
So you're saying he might have mentioned to you,
Who he had been consulting, yes.
but you can't recall any discussion with him about that?
Specifically who he spoke to, I cannot recall.
Okay. This drawing, in the bottom right-hand corner, it's dated the 24th of September 2013, and it was a drawing that was included as part of the employer's requirements package. It's number 127906110. And I want to look at the right-hand side of the drawing, right at the top, that proposed section, typical bay. If we can zone in on that as much as possible. And at the top of that, if we look at the fourth tag down, there's some writing that says, ensure horizontal and vertical cavity barriers meet tightly. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And at the bottom of that, one tag up, we see also cavity fire barrier in line with compartment floor structure. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Again, under P10, both under P10435. So this is showing an arrangement where we've got cavity barriers along the line of compartment floors. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it does not show any cavities around the windows, does it? Certainly none at the sill level.
Correct.
And did you notice that at the time these drawings were being prepared?
No.
And can you help us as to precisely why the arrangement is as it is on this drawing, with nothing at sill level?
I repeat, I understood the purpose of the cavity barriers was to limit the spread of fire within the cavity. The cavity was outside, so I did not think that there was any reason to. Well, I'm putting words. I'm inventing it. I do not recall seeing there to be a need for a cavity barrier under the window.
No. At the time, do you know if it was intended that that cavity barrier at the compartment floor line at the head of the window should also act as a barrier to inhibit the passage of fire into the cavity of the external wall in the first place? Do you know whether that was the intention?
My understanding, which is reflected on this drawing, is that the cavity was outside. So the barrier only happens to offer protection. Any flame exiting the window would find its way into the cavity.
So you weren't aware of guidance at the time of the importance of preventing the flame from entering the cavity around the sides of the windows, getting into that cavity in the first place?
I don't think that's clear in section 9.
You don't think that's clear in section 9? Okay.
No, that diagram reflects a conventional cavity construction, whether it be timber frame or masonry.
So where section 9 refers to cavity barriers around openings, what wasn't clear about that?
That cavity I interpret as an internal space, which therefore has some degree of protection or concealment of flame. Whereas in a rain screen, the facade is external.
Did you ever check your interpretation of that with Exova?
No. Well, not me, no.
Can we go to your statement again at paragraph 267? This is SEA 30144273 at page 113. At the end of that paragraph, at the top of the page, you say this in the final lines. You're talking about, you say, given the level of detail on the latter drawing, such as the reference to the 25mm gap on the horizontal barrier being consistent with the siderized cavity barriers that I believe were installed, I believe that the location of the cavity barriers must have been determined with specialist input. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, do you mean that in your view there's a high level of detail on the drawing?
Clarity. There is some clarity on the proposal, yes. I wouldn't say high level of detail, but there's clarity.
And when you say there it must have been determined with specialist input, do you know who provided that specialist input?
Side-rise, Lamatherm, I think, was the name that we had, were specified.
But I'm talking about whether they were actually consulted and asked about this. Do you know that Siderise were consulted at the tender stage about this arrangement? Or are you just assuming from the fact that you've specified in the NBS Siderise cavity barriers that they were?
I recall Thomas discussing this with me and him having consulted others. I repeat, I couldn't remember exactly whom he had discussed this with or whether he had more than one. My understanding now is that he would have consulted with Siderise, but that's based on
But it's right, isn't it, that
information.
we haven't found, I don't think you've found, any emails or written record of such a consultation occurring?
No, and I can't obviously confirm what Thomas did. I don't believe I was in the office.
I'm going to put it to you that because the guidance in approved document B about providing cavity barriers around openings is clear, that specialist input should not really have been necessary at that tender stage. It should have been obvious that cavity barriers should be put around the windows.
I obviously have given this a lot of thought, and I did watch Professor Luke Bisbee's testimony, so I tend to agree to achieve I agree with him that I can't see how you achieve what's required, where you have to provide a half hour in both directions when you're supporting the window with aluminium. So I don't think,
But
with hindsight, I don't think I agree that it was clear on a rain screen what the intention was in the document.
Okay. Can we go back to the drawing that we were just looking at, SEA 402499? And I want to look instead at the elevation of the facade that we see on the top left. Now, it's right, isn't it, that that's not marked up to show where cavity barriers should be located, is it?
The elevation?
Yeah.
No.
No. And I want to show you some drawings in Mr. Hyatt's report on this topic. Can we go to PHYR 603 at page 44 and look at figure 3.16? And if we can blow that up, this is the first in a series of drawings in which he shows elevations of the facade and what the scheme of cavity barriers, in his view, should have been. And he's done that for a series of elevations. We can see that, for example, if we go on at page 45 and 46 within this. He's look at different he calls them conditions, different parts of the facade which had different configurations, and he's showing in an elevation where the cavity barriers should be. Can you just explain, it's a general question, why you didn't produce similar drawings at tender stage, clearly showing the elevations of the tower and where the cavity barriers were required?
We didn't think they would be necessary for the tender.
Do you agree that that would have been a relatively straightforward exercise to do?
I think it would have stepped into the stage F stage of the Bba plan of work, where you are dictating what you want the contractor to do. In other words, you're taking a traditional line on information and design. Traditional line as in the architect instructs and the contractor constructs.
I see. And when you're saying F stage, you mean
Stage F.
F after tender? Because remember, we were looking at a drawing. The drawing I showed you was part of the employer's requirements.
Yes.
So it would be after the technical design stage, stage E?
No, F is technical design. So this level of commitment to the scheme, to me, would fall more obviously into a stage F.
I see. At the time you were working on the tender or overseeing what was being done on the tender, did you personally look at any information on the Siderise website about where cavity barriers should be installed in a rain screen cladding system?
No, I didn't.
Did you know that they have a video available which very clearly shows this?
No.
And do you know if anyone else at Studio E consulted the Siderise product brochure to see where they advise cavity barriers should be located?
We have just the one Siderise document on file, which discusses the horizontal and vertical products, but not detail on their location, no.
Okay. Now I want to turn to what the MBS specification said about cavity barriers. Can we go to SEA 50169 at page 246? And if we can look at item 435. Is that on that page? Is that all that's shown on that page? No, that might be a wrong reference. At item 435, Studio E specified Lamatherm horizontal...
Do you want to get that up?
I can. I'll just get the reference.
Well, otherwise, it's a bit hard to
Yeah,
find.
I understand. There it is. Thank you. 246. Yeah. Okay. So this is item 435, ventilated cavity barriers. And we can see that the product reference, a few lines down, is said to be Lamatherm horizontal and Lamatherm vertical. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And those were Siderise products, is that correct?
Yes. This is the data sheet we have on our record, which I believe was saved earlier in the year, and that's why I believe Adrian Jess may have done some research.
Yeah. And then if you look a few bullets from the bottom, it's got a heading fire resistance rating, and it says 3030. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, we know the minimum performance standard in approved document B was 30 minutes insulation and 15 minutes integrity. Does the 30-30 here refer to insulation and integrity?
That would be my reading.
Yeah. So is it right that the cavity barriers actually exceed the minimum performance standard if looking at the guidance in approved document B?
Yes.
Were you aware of that at the time?
No.
And the specification also says installation requirements, two items down from that, so just one up from the bottom, installation requirements. It says continuous with minimum joints. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Was it meant by that there should be no breaks in the horizontal cavity barriers?
Yes.
Did you give any consideration at this stage to how cavity barriers would interface with any cladding rails that were used?
At this stage, I think we were looking at a sort of helping hand bracket. They called it a T bracket, which would not normally conflict with they're spaced out, so they wouldn't normally conflict with barriers.
I see. So was it something you were generally aware of, that there was a need to make sure that the bracketry for the cladding panels didn't interfere with the continuous nature of the cavity barriers?
You appreciate the design that Thomas prepared, or the drawing that Thomas prepared is not based on what was built. It's based on a simpler system with brackets that I believe could have avoided any conflict or clash with the cavity barriers.
Okay. Do you know whether any research was done at this stage about any test certification that supported the use of these barriers in a rain screen system?
No.
Did you or anyone else, to your knowledge, at Studio E discuss the suitability of these cavity barriers in a rain screen system with the manufacturer, with Cider Eyes?
I'm not aware. I did not have those conversations, so I'm not aware of them. But I believe they must have happened, but I don't know.
Did it ever occur to you that in the event of a fire, the ACM might buckle and provide a route for fire to spread within the cavity, notwithstanding the presence of cavity barriers?
That doesn't quite make sense. If the cladding has buckled, it's created a void, which would be outside.
Yes, and there's no hard surface for the cavity barrier, the intermescent, to expand and seal, is there?
It's outside, yes.
Yeah.
And that, my understanding is that's the degree of protection that the barrier offers. It's only until the cladding fails.
Can we move forward in time to a query that was raised by Harley much later on in the project in March 2015? Can we go to SEA 30/12906? If we can blow up the top of that, what we can see is that on the 6th of March 2015, there's an email from Neil Crawford to Kevin Lamb and Simon Lawrence. Kevin Lamb was doing work at that time for Harley, and Simon Lawrence for Ryden, copying you in and others. And he says, "Hi Kevin, as per telephone conversation, I have asked the question of X-over on the fire break but not had anything back. To me, the fire breaks would have to follow the ratings of the party walls, which are shown on the fire plan attached. You can see some of the low-level apartments are separated by 120 minutes and others by 60 minutes. Do you see that?"
Yes.
And attached to that is a fire strategy drawing. Do you remember looking at the drawings that were attached to this email at the time?
No.
So you didn't...
I was copied in as as being notionally still the project lead, but Neil was fronting it.
So does that mean that you wouldn't have looked at those drawings and noticed that there were no cavity barriers at the head, jamb or sill of the windows in those drawings?
No, I wouldn't have scrutinised the email which was copied to me for information.
Okay. Can we go back to SEA 30012906? So Mr. Crawford is saying there that he's asked the question of Exova on the fire break but not had anything back. Now, just to put this in context in terms of time again, the NBS specification was dated January 2014. Can you explain why it was that in March 2015 the question of the fire resistance of the cavity barriers was still outstanding?
I think this pertains to Neil's evidence as to the RFI that Harley raised and the conversations that ensued.
Yeah, but did this not alert you to the fact that Exova's advice was unfinished or incomplete on the external wall? The fact that this query was being raised?
At the time, no. I understood that there was a discussion going on. That's all I recall.
Did you note at the time that the question had been asked of Exova, but they hadn't had anything back yet?
No.
And this didn't prompt you to ask Exova for a comprehensive strategy or advice on the specific cladding proposals at that time?
No.
And I want to ask you just a few questions about cavity barriers in the crown. If we can go to drawing SEA 402551, and we'll need the offline version of that. This is dated, it's a drawing, you can take it from me, I appreciate it's small, it's dated the 26th of September 2013, and it also formed part of the employer's requirements. And it's a drawing of the facade where it meets the top of the building, the crown of the tower. If we look at the very top right-hand side, so I want to look at that section on the right. If we can go into that. Do you see at the very first label at the top, it says design of the crown detail, TBC by architect. Do you see that there?
Yes.
So is it right that at that stage, that part of the design was outstanding? It hadn't been worked out yet?
Correct, yes.
And does it also follow that not much thought will have gone at that stage into where cavity barriers should be located at the crown?
Correct.
Now we can see a horizontal cavity barrier that appears to be there at the root, at the head of the window on the top floor. Can you see there's a smaller hatched little rectangle there? Do you see that?
Sorry, at the head of the window?
Yeah.
Yes.
But there's no other detailing about cavity barriers at the top of the building, is there?
No.
And no indication of how the horizontal cavity barriers at the top would meet with the vertical cavity barriers?
Well, it's a section rather than a detail at the corner, but there are dotted lines
I see.
beyond, which, as they appear on the section on the left, I would interpret as being the barriers behind the cladding.
We don't get an elevation of that, do we?
No.
We haven't been able to find one. So was it the intention that Studio E would be carrying out further detailed design work of the crown at a later stage?
The design is outstanding because of the ongoing planning negotiations. And believe it was clarified as part of the, actually, I think it was part of the material submission.
Can I show you another drawing from Mr. Hyatt's report? This is PHYR 603 at page 50, and it's figure 3.21. And this is Mr. Hyatt's elevation, where he's shown how, in his opinion, cavity barriers should have been arranged around the crown at the head of the building. Do you see that?
Yes.
Can you explain why Studio E never produced a similar drawing to this on the Grenfell project? An elevation which looked at the cavity barrier detailing at the top of the building.
I think this comes back to the same position as we did not expect to be detailed designing every aspect of the envelope.
Okay. So that was something you left to Harley and Ryden to work out, was it?
Correct.
Staying with the crown for a moment, can we go to SEA 406663? This is an email to Paul Dunkerton on the 16th of November 2012. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And these seem to be notes from your from the Architecture Appraisal Panel AAP meeting on the 15th of November 2012. Is that right?
Correct.
And at the fourth bullet from the bottom, it records. It says white lump at top, opportunity to do something with the top of the building, amenity space ? Conservatory ? Do you see that there?
Yes.
And you've said in your statement that in response to this, Studio E increased the height and elaborated the design of the crown. That's at paragraph 154.3 of your statement. Is that correct?
It's correct.
Now, is it right then that some changes to the crown were then suggested as part of the value engineering process? Let's look at a document. Can we go to SEA 407672? This is an email dated the 22nd of May 2013 from Robert Powell of Appleyards, later Artelia, to Philip Booth of Artelia, copying you in. Do you see that?
Yes.
And I want to look at the second paragraph. We can see there he says, the perception is that if we retain the planned external envelope treatment, alloy windows, and only reduce the scale of the crown, then we are not departing too wildly from the existing planning application. And then he talks about what the biggest question mark remains over the access to the walkway and the lift. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And is it right that any reduction in the scale of the crown would have been subject to the approval of the planning officers?
At this point, I'm sorry, you've jumped over quite a big event, which was that architect's appraisal panel.
Yeah.
And the feedback we received.
Yeah.
And what happened thereafter.
Right.
Are you wanting me to comment on?
The question I asked you is it right that this would all be subject to the approval of the planning officers, and that their judgment would be based on appearance rather than considerations of fire safety?
Correct. Yes.
Now, I think we've seen that no detailed design work had been done for the crown at the tender stage. We just looked at that. Can we just look at something in the very first draft of the MBS specification, dated the 21st of November 2013? Can we go to that SEA 50152? So this draft, we know, or we believe it was dated the 21st of November 2013, and it was a draft before the one on the 29th of November 2013, which was issued to tenderers, yeah?
Sorry, this was January, correct?
This was 21st of November 2013. So this is what we think is the first draft of the NBS specification that we can find. There seems to be another one on the 29th of November 2013, and then there's the one from January 2014, which was the final version. Can you recall who was sent this first draft of the NBS specification?
No. I believe if it was a first draft, it possibly wasn't issued for tender.
No, I don't think it was issued for tender. We think it might have been sent to the TMO, but we can't see it being sent to anybody else. Might that be right?
I can't recall.
Okay. Can we look at page 81 within this draft, this first draft? And I want to look at clause 130. So this earlier version has some detail included for the crown, which was not included in the later versions. And it states under material, do you see it says there, it's the second bullet point there, and it says material, panel made up of 2 sheets of zinc that are 0.5 millimetre thick and thermo-glued on either side of a mineral-rich polyethylene core. Do you see that?
Yes.
And I want to ask you about those words, mineral-rich polyethylene core. Did you appreciate at the time that the reference to that mineral-rich polyethylene core was likely referring to an FR, fire retardant core?
No.
So...
No, I didn't prepare this in the first instance.
Do you know
I'm not sure that would have...
who within Studio E?
Sorry, you hadn't finished.
I'm not sure who did prepare this, although I keep bringing up work that was done almost a year before this, but I think a good portion of this specification had been completed by Adrian Jess.
Okay.
And he would have, he may well have put this in. But there was never any intention to have a different to the crown as to the rest of the building.
I want to ask whether or not you were aware, though, at the time that there had been a desire to provide a superior fire rating for the crown over and above the fire rating for panels on the rest of the building lower down.
No.
So you can't explain to us why this is talking about a mineral-rich polyethylene core?
I think it's because the specification goes back to anywhere from December 12 to February 13, when we were considering a zinc composite. And this is a secondary clause to H92, a non-standard item being the crown. So I think the first draft, possibly for this H92, made reference to VM zinc. That's my
I see. Yeah.
understanding.
But you see why we're asking you about this. You can understand why the reference to a mineral-rich polyethylene core, something
I
that...
think that's copy-pasted from manufacturer's information.
I see. But you don't think it would have been understood within Studio E that was a superior panel to the one that finally appeared for the more general sections of the tower in the later version of the MBS spec? Or at least...
From my side, definitely not. Mineral rich is ambiguous.
I see. When I say superior, I mean superior to the Rainer Bond ACM panel that was one of the alternatives.
The core you meant, you're talking about superior core or superior finish?
Superior fire performance.
No.
Now, can we just look at another drawing? We're almost finished this topic. The SEA 402596. This is another one of the employer's requirement drawings. And if we see at the top of the building, is it right that this drawing is showing what some people have described, I think, on the project as a radiator effect design for the top of the building, which is what was ultimately installed, wasn't it?
Yes.
So channels of ACM, C-shaped channels that were interconnecting.
The white lump that we'll also refer to in his feedback at the AAP is the plant room at the top, the tank rooms, the lift motor room,
Yeah.
and the other, for instance, the exhausts for the bathrooms and the
Yeah.
fire lobbies are all contained within that concrete box, which is set back from the edge.
Yeah, and the
existing
smoke extraction comes out that top as well.
And the existing building included perforated precast panels, which you will see on earlier photographs, which provided a kind of crown, existing crown. And this was our solution to concealing that existing precast element, to unify the appearance.
Did you ever consider the fire safety of the crown at any point during the design process?
I'm afraid we were not aware of the combustible risk of ACM. Otherwise, of course, we would. That to my thinking at the time, was just metal outside, and therefore presented no hazard or risk.
I see. So, does it follow that were there ever any discussions, forget ACM for a moment, about the crown and fire in relation to the crown, and the need to consider whether or not the crown might be a vehicle for fire spread in the event of an external fire?
I watched Professor Torreira's evidence because I certainly didn't understand the risk that it posed.
No. So is the answer to my question no, it was never discussed?
No.
Sorry, my transcript's still not working. Can you just be clear, was it ever discussed?
No, it was never discussed.
In terms of the design of the windows now, there's one more topic on cavity barriers, which I just want to cover. Did you ever discuss the cavity barrier strategy with Mr. Crawford? When he gave his evidence, he said that you were adamant that the cavity barrier strategy was correct. And what he seemed to mean by that was, i.e., none around the windows, but just along compartment lines. He said that at day 10, page 190, lines 13 to 15. Do you recall being adamant in discussions with Mr. Crawford about the cavity barrier strategy being correct?
I can't remember being adamant about the cavity barrier strategy being correct, but I was confident that Thomas had checked it with someone and that it was viable. It was. We could expect it to be accepted. I had confidence in what Thomas had presented to me.
Would you agree that a reasonably competent architect would prepare an indicative design of, amongst other things, the cavity barrier arrangement for stages, RIBA stages D and E?
No.
Does it follow that you don't agree, therefore, that this work should start with a review of statutory standards and relevant guidance?
The principles were understood, so I'm not sure I understand the question.
Did Studio E, to your knowledge, ever do a review of statutory standards and relevant guidance for the cavity barrier arrangement at Grenfell Tower?
I think I want to repeat what I said earlier. These statutory requirements as contained in the brief document are guidance and requires a high degree of interpretation. So it's not possible to go down a list and tick off items.
Because I think the question was whether Studio E had undertaken an investigation into that. Wasn't that your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
On our own, I think that's. I can only refer to what's borne out in Thomas's and Neil's evidence as evidence that we did take steps to check.
Can we just look at a couple of examples from Mr. Hyatt's report before we break? If we can go to PHYR 603 at page 64. So here, and in a series of drawings, what Mr. Hyatt has done is he's indicated where the position of the cavity barriers was as indicated in the Harley drawings, and then where the cavity barrier position, he says, should have been at the window jamb. So it's the difference between the solid red line and the dotted red line. Do you see that there?
Yes.
And there are a number of these drawings. Let's look at another one, for example, at the sill. If we look at page 65, he's outlined in a dotted line where at the sill level a cavity barrier ought to have been, whereas no cavity barrier was shown in the Harley drawings. And then at the window head on the next page, 65, he's indicated that the cavity barrier should have been immediately at the window head in the dotted line rather than remote from it in the solid red line. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Did you think it was Studio E's responsibility to address this kind of detailing in its designs?
No.
Can you explain why? Why not?
This level of detail is special stage F fabrication or detail design. So I don't believe that fell to us to direct Harley on as to how they propose to satisfy the requirements of the employer's requirements.
So that was my next question. Did you think it was Studio E's responsibility to make sure Harley addressed this kind of detail in its designs?
Under what authority?
Well, under the Ryden deed of appointment, for example, seek to ensure that designs met the statutory standards. That was one provision within that deed of appointment. But forget the detail of that deed for a moment. I just want to know whether you understood at the time that it was Studio E's responsibility to make sure Harley addressed that kind of detailing in its designs.
I don't believe it was at all. I think that would have created duties which we did not expect to have. That would have placed full design responsibility on Studio E. So I think it was a very clear line, and that is very typical of design and build as a method of procurement.
So does it follow then that you wouldn't have expected Mr. Crawford to pick up on those kind of design issues? For example, nothing at the sill, and you wouldn't have expected Mr. Crawford to be questioning that when he was being shown the drawings?
I think you have to look at each detail on its own, but if you take this option here, this detail in front of me where the location of the barrier above the window needing to be literally at the window head to me, introduces all sorts of practical problems for the installer. And I also am not clear why that would have been a requirement under any reading of the approved document. So I think the onus on Neil to flag it is false. I don't think he did have that onus.
Just one final question, if I may. Were you ever personally involved in considering Harley's design drawings after Studio E was novated to Ryden, or did you leave that task to Mr. Crawford?
As far as I can recall, that I left that entirely to Neil. I certainly remember seeing drawings coming in, but I didn't seek to study them.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I understand there's been a bit of a problem with the transcript.
Well, mine
live
hasn't been running
transcript.
at least.
Yours has?
No, mine
No,
hasn't been running, and
okay.
nor's the one up there.
Well, we'll have to investigate what's happened over the lunch break, but that is an appropriate moment, if that's okay.
Yes, well, we'll have a break now for lunch, Mr. Sounes. We'll come back at 2 o'clock, please. And you go to the usher. Don't talk to anyone about your evidence, please. Ms. Grange, I'm sure that those who are dealing with the transcript know there's a problem. I can only apologise to you and everyone else who's trying to make use of it, and we'll hope that it's back in action at 2 o'clock.
Exactly.
All right?
Thank
2
you.
o'clock, please. Thank you.